Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bungacast, and a special hello to those of you, the hardcore refuseniks, outraged at the fact that we're not officially Alpha Bunga Bunga anymore. You can keep calling us that. I actually have great respect for you. Anyway, this is Bungacast. My name is Alex Hochuli. It's Thursday, the 6th of January, 2022, and I'm joined, as always, by George Hoare. Hi, George.
Hi, Alex.
Philip Cunliffe. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Alex.
Oh, that's good. And a returning guest, our good friend Anton Jäger, is back on the pod. Hi, Anton. How is sunny Brussels?
Yeah, not sunny at all, but very, very glad to be back.
Good. No, I've never known Brussels to be sunny, and that's not even a commentary on the EU. You know, Brussels is far more than a metonym, as we discovered when we discussed Belgium with you last time you were on. Anyway, just to give people a little bit of context, we're back now in 2022. We've hit the reset button. We've done a grand reset, if you will. And just to tell you what we're looking forward to doing over the course of this year, we're going to, of course, continue trying to provide deeper insight into national politics around the world, be it Kazakhstan or Kalamazoo. I had to look up where Kalamazoo was before doing this. Apparently it's in Michigan. So there you go. We're not going to be doing anything about Kalamazoo.
Maybe don't insult our Rust Belt listeners in Michigan, Alex. You know, like,
well, we don't
actually quite important.
We don't need to talk about them. What they need recognition now, like, oh, hi, Rust Belt people in Kalamazoo. It's probably actually rural. I don't think it's properly. Anyway, whatever.
For every one listener from Kalamazoo we lose, we'll gain two from Kazakhstan.
We'll also be discussing big ideas with very interesting guests from a variety of critical perspectives. That is what we do, and that is what we will continue doing. I also wanted to give a shout out to our revamped reading club. We have redesigned it for 2022 around three key themes: one, emergency politics and control; two, cynical ideology; and three, techno-feudalism. The reading list contains everything that we feel is essential to read to understand the world in 2022 and beyond. So we hope you will join us for that. It's all at patreon.com/Bungacast. Now, today we're going to talk about hyperpolitics. Now, regular listeners will know. If you're new to us, I'm just going to say this and explain this out for just a second so that we're all on the same page. Phil, George, and I, as Bungacast, put out a book last year called The End of History. And in that, we discuss a shift from the end of the post-Cold War period, which was dominated by post-politics, and move towards anti-politics, otherwise known as populism. Now, what does that mean? It was basically the idea that this form of post-politics, which dominated Western politics for 30 years, from 1989 until, let's say, 2016, was dominated by this strategy of depoliticization, of removing serious issues from political contestation and putting them away from the public in places like central banks, for example. And all of this was wrapped together under an ideology of consensus, that we're all on the same page. We believe all big ideas are settled, and all that is necessary is to find the right technical solutions to social problems. And who will do that? Experts will be brought in to resolve those problems. Suddenly, that all seems to fall apart after the global financial crisis of 2008. And you get this rise of anti-politics, a strong rejection of the establishment, but which often doesn't seem to propose anything else in its place. It's more just pure rejectionism. One way of describing that shift, and it's something that Anton does in this article of his that we're going to discuss with him in just a second, is a shift from mass politics to a situation in which there's a void, where the people are removed from politics. People are no longer members of political parties, civic associations, and so on. Suddenly, with this return of politics in the 2010s, you find that the people are back. But they're back at a time when politics is weirder than ever. People are no longer held together, encased in political organization institutions. So politics becomes much weirder and free-floating. Anton's article is about hyperpolitics. Now, in our book, The End of History, we talk about how that return of political energies may end up being diverted or channeled into culture wars, into new forms of culture war. And that's, I think, something that we've seen very strongly in the US, but increasingly across Europe as well. So that instead of maybe a genuine repoliticization, you get this kind of maybe somewhat superficial polarization, debates about culture and who we are rather than where do we want to go as a society. But I want to put a question mark on that, because that's actually what we're going to discuss. Anton's article is called How the World Went from Post-Politics to Hyperpolitics. I heartily recommend it. It came out in Tribune on the first week of January, and there's links to it in the show notes. So let's actually get properly started. Anton, hyperpolitics as an idea, what does that actually mean? It seems like everything is being politicized today except the really important stuff.
Yeah, really good question. So I want to say that as a concept, hyperpolitics is hugely underdeveloped. I think I lifted it from a piece by Slavoj Žižek in an introduction he wrote to Rancière in the late 1990s, where he describes Rancière as a hyperpolitical thinker. And for him, in a sort of bad way, insofar as he thinks that Rancière doesn't actually offer a convincing theory about how politics and policy interact, or how politics can culminate in policy and how policy can feed back into politics. Whereas Zizek seems to say about Rancière, well, this is just a hyperpolitical thinker who has no sense about how antagonism or how polarization can ever institutionalize itself in sort of active governance. Today, I think the best way to describe it is not the same as a cultural war. It's not the same as the concept of techno-populism you discussed on some previous episodes. But I think we can describe it best in contrast to the concepts you've used in your own book, which is either post-politics or anti-politics, and to make clear why it is neither of those two things. So it's not post-politics insofar as it doesn't participate in this very easy liberal post-historical consensus, which basically assumes that all ideological questions are solved and politics has basically become reduced to questions of administration. So it's definitely not that insofar as it is intensely political. We could always say hysterically political insofar as it does have space for political disagreement and it has space for political antagonism. While at the same time, it's also not the anti-politics we knew from the 2010s insofar as it rejects representation in the same way, but it does make very strong institutional demands. So you can see this in some of the wokeness that we've witnessed in the last 2 years, or some of those culture wars, that in demands of reparations, or for example, with climate marches for central banks to do climate policy, there are very, very concrete institutional demands. So it's not the case that they say, get rid of them all or throw the entire political class out. It is a form of politics which asks very specific things from the elite, but which doesn't actually conform to the models of politics we know from the 20th century either, which were mass political, in which people gathered in these units, after which they made demands to a state. So those are the four concepts we can work with. It's not anti-politics, it's not post-politics, but it's also not mass politics. It's a sort of distinct new modality which politics takes in the 21st century, which I think is familiar and very, very confusing. So I'm not sure I fully figured out what it means, but I think in contrast, we can come to a definition.
Well, I mean, so just for the sake of listeners, just for the sake of listeners, I mean, and to put this discussion that we're having right here in context, I guess what's at issue, or kind of what's at play, is a conception that we brought in our book about the shift from post-politics to anti-politics, to this kind of rejectionist attitude, and Anton's idea of hyperpolitics, which he's bringing in as to suggest a sort of move beyond or move onwards from what was happening in the 2010s, or the so-called populist decade, and that this hyperpolitics isn't just that rejection, it's making, as Anton says, concrete institutional demands. I think that's quite interesting, and I'm trying to maybe give it some concrete form. So I don't know, to Anton, but also George and Phil, can we describe some concrete examples of this, of hyperpolitics today?
Well, that was just what I was going to ask Anton, if he could give some examples, because so what you say in the piece is, I mean, you make the case that things feel like they're more politicized, like you say, kind of with wokeness, but also in terms of the way you have these kind of set piece confrontations over particular issues that then bounce around between people's favored media outlets. I guess the very fact that people more strongly identify with particular media outlets and have their favored spokespeople, whether it's Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or whoever it might be. So that feels like it's political. But I'm not sure that everything is political. The way that you indicate in the piece feels like there is more politics. And I suppose for some people, it will feel like, there's politics where they don't want it. Social conservatives who might be kind of put out or confused or disgusted or angry, say, about disputes over transgender rights, for instance, and they won't understand why these issues that they took for granted are suddenly being treated in an entirely different way. But that's not to say everything is political in the way perhaps that things were kind of divided left and right in the Cold War, where you had kind of where you had left-wing architects and, kind of free market affiliated architecture, or where you have, say, different kind of plans, I don't know, colonizing space right down to, consumer goods or kitchen kind of urban planning and kitchen design. So I suppose, when you say everything is political, do you mean it literally, or do you mean the sense that politics is kind of suddenly things are political in a way that they weren't in the era of the deep freeze?
Yeah, very good question. And I want to make clear that I don't want to come across as somehow, I wouldn't say serenading or somehow approving of this new situation as salutary or containing a sort of emancipatory core. I don't think the politicization we're actually currently seeing at the moment is in any way more than superficial. And in another way, it's extremely, extremely superficial. But something can be highly one-dimensional, but very intense in that one dimension. And I think that's precisely what we're talking about in the case of hyperpolitics. So I think the concrete examples we can talk about is precisely these demands, which are, for example, made within the Black Lives Matter protests for reparations or for all kinds of institutional forms of redemption, which are sometimes quite institutionally ambitious. So if you actually want to enact a proposal such as reparations, or if you actually want to overhaul an old school curriculum, that is quite a task, which will require quite some resources and quite a lot of adaptation on behalf of other people. If you have, for example, teenagers working on these climate marches, which are asking for central banks to do specific forms of green QE, those are also like institutionally quite ambitious demands, but they're very, very narrow in that they either presume that experts will solve the question for you, or the action we need to take is purely individual. So if you make decisions on individual level on who you date, what kind of products you buy, what kind of people you interact with, who you follow on social media, then the collective solutions or the collective results will follow automatically.
It seems to be
high. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that it seems to me like, especially what you're describing is that often there's no mediation between some very grand demands, yes, often wrapped up in a lot of catastrophist rhetoric. If you think about climate change, while at the same time, there's no mediation between that and then the actual very specific measures which are being demanded. There's no politics there, politics in the sense of the way that demands or ideas are channeled through to the actual implementation. I don't know. Is that?
Yeah, I was going to say,
does that tally with what you're saying?
Or the back of what Anton was saying. So, but is that, yeah, well, I suppose it just what you said, Anton, the idea is it's, if you do these things, that the result is kind of spontaneous. That was the sense of what you were saying, right? So if you do if you shop in the right way, if you and everybody else kind of adopted the appropriate behaviors and consumed the right information, there would be no need for any kind of, trade-offs between different social groups, or the imposition of social costs on disproportionate social costs in one group over another, which requires kind of, I'm trying to think of the classical model of politics where those this collective decisions are taken through representative institutions, negotiations, conflict, and so on, and that all of that doesn't happen. And so it's still a kind of, like Alex says, unmediated vision of politics, almost still a kind of a marketized vision where everything happens through the kind of this spontaneous alignment through modification of consumer behavior, essentially, and that the result is automatic.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's a perfect summary, and it shows that you could almost call it a Hayekian form of politics, and that there's a spontaneous order which will institute itself once we all make the right individual consumer choices, and then there will be a collective result which will be emancipatory. And I think you can see it most explicitly in the techno-populist proposals you discussed before about Extinction Rebellion and these people's assemblies, is that you basically have the complete shortcutting of mediation, in that through sortition, a random group of citizens is put into this assembly which is then advised by experts who, of course, have the right opinions on the particular climate question, would then propose or compile a list of suggestions, which are then handed over to experts and technocrats who will then implement it basically by decree through emergency politics. And the degree of involvement or the degree of polarization you see around these questions is hyperpolitical. But as you say, there is no moment for mediation in which, for example, the existence of a conflict of interest is even acknowledged. So the way Extinction Rebellion looks at the climate crisis is that you have nature and humanity preys on nature. And what needs to be done is that humanity reconceives of its relationship through nature. But there's never a question, for example, of what actually the vested institutional legacies are, for example, of a carbon coalition or carbon sectors, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I think that the sort of starting point of the hyperpolitics thesis is quite plausible, because now everything is small p political. You have and part of this is driven by those hated academics who do things like the politics or the international relations of Hello Kitty or urinals in Scotland or anything like this. You might recognize some of these examples, listeners. But yeah, I mean, it seems like that is something which we all recognize. It's definitely the flip side of that exclusion of the big questions from political discussion. If you're not kind of if the economy is not up for grabs, then where does people's dissatisfactions, people's agonistic energies, all those sorts of things, it gets transferred to a whole range of consumer behaviors, things which form your identity, things which distinguish you from others in a similar sort of social context. I mean, I guess my question back to you, Anton, would be are the people who are doing this hyperpolitics essentially PMC types? Is this turning of the focus of politics onto identitarian concerns and some of the other things that you talked about? Is this predominantly being led by fairly small kind of groups of people within all these different national contexts, because they essentially have they're in the material situation to turn these kind of cultural battles to their material advantage?
I'm not entirely sure it's that class exclusive, or whether this is a group of people who seem naturally interested in politics, whether it's a sort of institutional or organized politics, and which always seem to have a stake in some of these contests. But what I'm talking about with hyperpolitics is also this broader cultural mood, which really runs across the entirety of society. And now I'm giving kind of anecdotal evidence, but I see it even in my friendship circles with people who I've known since my early school years, who I would describe as profoundly anti-political, with not even the faintest interest in questions of politics, but who in the last 2 years, mainly as a response to events such as COVID, or even the anti-police brutality protest or the sort of general anti-racist favor, suddenly find themselves in a process of really chaotic and rapid politicization. They suddenly have opinions and views of all these issues, and they really want to make them heard, without questioning their moral credentials in making these points. What's very typical about it is that these are not necessarily professionals, they're not necessarily people who have a background of an interest in politics, but who suddenly feel as if politics or certain political opinions or behaviors, as Phil said, do in fact matter. They acquire an almost existential stake. And sometimes I feel with other friends who have been interested in politics for a longer time, that it almost makes them yearn for a type of post-politics where they say, I wish we could just go back to a time where people didn't actually have opinions on these issues. Or I don't need to hear what my aunt thinks about pick any sort of culture that has happened in the last years. And I think that's quite a distinct change.
And that's what we've described as neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, this kind of nostalgia for a relatively recent past when things were quieter. And I guess one way of putting hyperpolitics in kind of much more effective terms is just that everything is very noisy. Nothing moves, but everything is very noisy. Hey there, this is just a quick note about the Bungacast Reading Club. There are various local reading clubs being set up in various places around the world, and if you'd like to form one or to join one, you should let us know. We've already had people come forward in the following cities: Amsterdam, Philadelphia, New York, Tallinn, Estonia, Berlin, London, San Francisco, Bay Area, and LA. So if you're interested, email us at info@bungacast.com or comment on the Patreon, and we'll try to get people in touch with one another so that you can arrange locally to follow along and discuss the works every month and have that interact with our recorded reading club episodes. All right, back to our discussion with Anton. George hinted at a very important question, which is kind of who is doing anti-politics, who is doing hyperpolitics, and who are the institutions and actors. But before that, I just wanted to kind of finish maybe filling out this idea and giving color to this notion of hyperpolitics. So we're all on the same page, so listeners are on the same page. One way that you describe this is that as a permanent Dreyfus affair, and I thought that was quite interesting. Can you describe maybe first for listeners who might not be familiar what the Dreyfus affair was and what a permanent Dreyfus affair would be today?
Well, yeah, the Dreyfus affair happened in the close of the 19th century in France, where this French military officer, if I'm correct, Officer Dreyfus, was basically accused of treason to the French Republic. And then there was a big question whether the people in the military who were actually prosecuting him had a case, and it split France across all these political lines, where some people thought he was in fact guilty, while others thought he was not guilty. But one of the typical ways in which the Dreyfus affair was portrayed in the media at the time, but also how it went down in history, is that it split families right through the middle. So there are these famous cartoons or these famous drawings in late 19th century France where you have a family dinner where everyone gets together, and then it says before they discuss Dreyfus, and then after they discuss Dreyfus, and after they discuss Dreyfus, everyone's basically on the table smashing each other's heads up with cutlery, and everything descends into, basically a riot. And of course, what was specific about the Dreyfus affair is that it had these very personal effects, but there were also these organized party blocks or organized political blocks that did require a stake in it. So you had a socialist position on it, you had a monarchist position on it, you had a sort of proto-fascist position on it. But the way the right often talks about these woke panics nowadays is precisely as if politics intrudes into the private or the personal sphere to a degree they find highly, highly uncomfortable. But since it's not just about this one figure, namely Dreyfus, but the political questions are so ubiquitous, from structural racism to the climate crisis, that anything can be the object of or a cause of political polarization. So you can go to a lunch meeting with work colleagues and you can suddenly find yourself discussing the question whether Black Pete is racist. So Black Pete is this blackface tradition you have in the south of the Netherlands, which is obviously racist. But all of a sudden, you can find yourself between two warring camps.
Are people defending that as not racist? Is this just some anti-Dutch kind of tirade you're about to go on?
Oh, yeah. It is a massive issue, certainly in the Netherlands. So Flanders, because Flanders doesn't have that much political conscience anyway. But in the Netherlands, certainly for the last 5 years, this is a sort of cyclical occurrence that every early December, when this children's feast takes place, there is a massive debate about whether Black Pete should remain or whether it's not. And I don't think anyone is going to deny that it's obviously a very, very racist symbol, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself the question. Just imagine a public debate which is exclusively polarized for 3 weeks around the question whether this children's feast, which happens once a year, on one day a year, is racist or not. And that produces a specific political culture, which is interesting in itself.
I mean, what strikes me in hearing you describe this, this sort of permanent Dreyfus affair, this idea that it's intensely personal, that it's politics obviously filtering down into intimate life. And of course, as Phil has already said as well, social conservatives often react against that because it's politicizing things that were taken for granted and completely naturalized. But what strikes me is that this is almost also the other moments in history when you have this intense personalization where politics comes into the home and kind of tears everything apart, is kind of either moments of civil war or proto-revolutionary moments. And it's almost like, and I've said this before in a different context, but it's almost like we're in a proto-revolutionary moment or a pre-revolutionary moment without a revolution. It's like, it's all the whirlwinds of revolution swirling around in your intimate life, but at the kind of level of politics proper, things aren't really shifting. People aren't storming any palaces. Let's put it that way. Although yeah. I do know that we're recording this on the 6th of January, and some people will be like, well, actually, just 1 year ago, people did storm the palace, but
And those storming palaces in Kazakhstan, apparently, as well, which you mentioned at the outset of the talk, Alex.
Kazakhstan's just going to hang over this, the whole discussion. Anyway.
Do you have like a whiteboard, 364 days without a palace storming, and then we have to go back to zero when we have one tomorrow?
And I think the sort of pre-revolution without actual revolutionaries, or revolutionaries without a revolution, is a valid analogy. At the same time, I would caution against the idea that this is wholly unprecedented, that we've never seen it in the course of modern history. So American history is full of these proto-cultural instances. If you take something like the Scopes trial or the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s, which is about the question of teaching evolution in Tennessee public schools, there was intense polarization and debate around this question, while at the same time the stakes didn't seem that high, certainly in an America which was to hit the worst depression only 5 years later, for example. So I wouldn't say it's completely unprecedented. What I do think is, how shall I put this? What I do think is that it's not just reducible to culture wars, insofar as it's not just about questions of culture. So it can concern questions of policy. It can concern questions of statecraft in some ways. It doesn't preclude the fact that it can include those factors, but at the same time, it's extremely one-dimensional in that it has no sense on how you mediate between the sort of basic political level and then the level of policy. And the clearest example I always give is when you see European politicians marching in those climate marches while they're in government themselves, they're basically admitting that the central banks and the Davos set will be in charge until the end of time. And the best you can do now is to basically march down the street and make these demands on technocrats to save you, instead of actually making decisions in the office that you're currently occupying.
Well, actually, that brings us on really nicely onto the question of kind of who's doing hyperpolitics, who are the actors, the institutions. And you write in the article, what passes for political action is monopolized by flash mobs, NGOs, and philanthropists with weak democratic mandates and non-existent membership bases. And so one way that you also describe this, which relates very closely to that, is that you don't have masses and mass politics, but you have a swarm where kind of groups of people, crowds, perhaps rather than masses, crowds appear at certain moments around determined issues and can be quite angry and violent, and then it dissipates all very quickly. And that, I guess, is definitely a feature of hyperpolitics. It's something which is, I guess, a feature of anti-politics, in that, people came out on the streets to denounce the political establishment as a whole. You can think of the occupation of squares, for example. But here you're saying maybe it's something different, where it's kind of about issues, sometimes making specific demands, not just a kind of rejection of the establishment. I wanted to ask you, because there's some interesting bodily corporeal metaphors in the article. One comes from Deleuze and Guattari, bodies without organs, and another one is the politics today is a head without a body and a body without a head. Do you care to explain these corporeal metaphors?
Here to explain, yeah. Jesus, so
no, sorry, I shouldn't have phrased it.
Yeah,
no.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Are these?
I can take responsibility for these bodies.
My question would be: are these compatible? Like, is it a body without a head and without organs, or is it a head without a body but with organs?
I think they're compatible. Yeah. I mean, and we're mainly talking about the brain, which is an organ, so in that sense, it's perfectly compatible. But the heads without bodies and bodies without heads analogy actually comes from the American sociologist Theda Skocpol, who uses it in her work on the specific history of American NGOs and American non-profit organizations. And she describes a shift since the 50s and 60s, where many of these voluntary civic associations actually had large membership bases, even when they were passive. But from the 60s and 70s onwards, these NGOs actually lose a large part of these members, while at the same time gaining more financial and institutional power than they've ever had before. So they don't have a body or a sort of internal metabolism anymore. They don't have internal membership bases they can appeal to, while at the same time they become ever more brainy in that they have large think tanks attached to them. They have a lot of, for example, VC or philanthropic money they can use. This makes them a very powerful head. But then you look at things such as Extinction Rebellion or some of the flash mobs and climate marches we saw last year, and they clearly refuse to institutionalize or refuse to professionalize on any level. So for the anti-police brutality protests of the last year, there were no membership lists. It was basically like receiving a text for a party in the middle of the night, and then you'd go there, you'd have a protest, and then people would disperse afterwards. And I think there you can at least make a comparison between the 6th of January insurrection, as it will say, or just the mob, and the anti-police brutality protests, is that there were both extremely potent and intense happenings as they were going on, but the institutional legacies are very, very weak, not to say non-existent. So the actual legacy of the anti-police brutality movements is that, of course, this was a big change. A police officer actually got convicted, while at the same time, if you look at all of the police departments in the US that defunded themselves or that were defunded last year have actually all got their funds back. So that has been completely reversed. While at the same time, it's not entirely clear that anything of that QAnon or Trump mob has actually coagulated or has actually become anything more permanent. So this is, again, the best example of how you can have very intense and direct political mobilization and politicization in real time, while leaving almost no institutional traces, even in the shorter term. And I think that is what I'm trying to get at with the hyperpolitics label.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, is it because the institutions don't exist to do it differently? Or is it that there's actually a kind of, not a fear of institutions, but a kind of a distrust of any kind of political institution making? So you have I think it could be both, but I just wondered what you thought about that, because it's clearly one of the kind of central characteristics of contemporary politics is that it's almost completely disintermediated with a few exceptions. But what explains that?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the institutions are not available insofar as civil societies, mainly dominated by these NGOs or these professional network institutions that can't really work with membership bases because that will create conflict between the base and their elite donors. At the same time, I think there's also a deeper sociological, or dare I say anthropological change, where certainly on the internet or with an exclusively digital civil society, exit costs for entering and leaving groups become so low that people actually find it very, very difficult to remain in certain organizations. So it simply means that institutions are not available, but if you think of creating institutions, you have to work with people who have a sense of institutional loyalty or are quite mobile, which makes it very, very difficult to form permanent bonds. And in many ways, the internet gives a substitute for that, in sort of that you can have long-term engagement on the internet itself. But as we all know, you can log off very cheaply as well. And the amount of social stigma that is attached to logging off, I think, is still quite negligible compared to these other civic associations.
Yeah, and it's a world where it's a scenario where the world of work is a reflection of the world of politics, or maybe the other way around. People, despite all the uncertainty that it causes, have a desire to be kind of self-employed or to be your own boss and whatever, and don't want kind of any long-lasting commitments of being in an organization and working your way up, for example, or whatever it might be. And politics seems to be the same. And I think to some degree that points to something that is much wider across society, because this is maybe something that maybe we all between ourselves disagree on this. I don't know about where this hyperpolitics, who the practitioners of hyperpolitics are, because I think Phil or George asked earlier, is this just the kind of PMC? Is this the kind of professional class liberals doing this? And I don't think that's right. I think it is, at the very least, what we're seeing is a politicization of the middle class. I mean, this is something that we wrote in the end of history, that this period is seeing the entry into politics of whole swathes of the middle class who otherwise would have been pretty quiescent, because by and large, politics worked for them, or the way that society was structured worked for them, and they were pretty happy to be quiet. So unless you were part of an intellectual strata, or were in the media or something, you probably didn't really have opinions about very much, other than maybe who the president of the United States was. You're like, oh yeah, that George Bush is an idiot, but it doesn't go beyond that. It's not like Trump, during the Trump period, where Trump became the issue at every dinner table, no matter where you were, however far flung it was from the United States. So my guess hypothesis is that it's a politicization of the middle class and a splitting of the middle class. So the more traditional petty bourgeoisie, owners of small business and whatever, kind of radicalized rightwards, and that the liberal professional classes, people who work in large organizations and corporations, especially in areas like academia and the media and so on, producers of ideas, politicized leftwards, and leftwards in scare quotes, because they politicized leftwards, especially on kind of cultural issues rather than economic issues. That's my kind of take on that. I don't know if you agree with that, or if you think it's even more broader, that it's filtered down even wider in society.
I take the point, Alex, just before, if I could interject, but I take the point, it's not just kind of the left PMC. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that it splits along a simple kind of left-right axis either, in the sense that if we think about responses to the lockdown, at the forefront of, say, lockdown skepticism, or some of the protest marches against vaccine mandates and so on, and the health passes, a lot of small business owners. And they're defending, they're defending civil liberty as well as their own social position and economic interests. And that doesn't seem to me to neatly fit a kind of a radicalization rightwards in any kind of meaningful sense, right? Or the fact that the people who have been most supportive of stronger state responses and stronger state authoritarianism in response to COVID and lockdown have been the PMC, or those kind of politically left liberals, but more in favor of authoritative responses by the state, and strong arm tactics. So I take the point, but I'm not sure that what we actually see is politicization along the traditional left-right axis.
No, and I think this is continuous with what you've put forward in your own work, is that there is a structural decline or a structural erosion of that left-right cleavage as the structural cleavage of so much politics. And I think what I'm discussing with the hyperpolitics is also about an acceleration towards a form of politics in which left and right becomes ever more confusing and ever more ideologically diffuse, insofar as there are plenty of issues in which the classical left and the classical right position are simply just irretrievable, because they mean so little also in organizational terms anymore. And again, I think we should look beyond the middle class and see it very much as a cross-class phenomenon. So whether you're looking at football matches, whether you're looking at the arts, whether you're looking at academia, but also whether you're looking at the very highest echelons of the corporate world, there is a sense that there are very, very big political imperatives on which are quite institutionally ambitious at times, but which are very, very narrow in their concerns. So for example, in the US, there are so few people left in the US who would deny that, for example, racial inequality is in any way a massive, massive issue for that country. At the same time, these behavioral and these affective changes, which people require for racial equality to become less acute, almost have no redistributive or no economic consequences whatsoever. So you can have a perfectly racially tolerant society in which there are no racial prejudices or biases whatsoever, but which racial inequality in economic terms is still staggeringly high, because no one can actually think of the fact that there must be a bigger structural issue at play here. And this is precisely in the way in which hyperpolitics is actually damaging, is that everyone can get completely hysterically worked up about these issues, while at the same time never thinking through the question of, okay, what would it mean if you actually want to save racial economic inequality if you don't want to redistribute wealth, for example?
Yeah, it's the whole. It's the only thing which can be competed over is the whole thing, because the different parts with competing interests aren't represented and don't don't battle off against each other. So you either reject it or embrace it as a whole. Yeah. Which also then leads to that kind of hyper moralized and conflictual sort of situation. Yeah.
So we're going to come on to the culture war question in just a second. But listener, if you're liking what you're hearing, why not subscribe to Bungacast? You can subscribe to us on Patreon, but also to make sure that you get all our free episodes, subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And also a plea, why don't you rate and review us? We'll also take negative reviews. That's cool as well. But tell us what you think and follow us on social media. Tell your friends as well, whether it's in real life or even your special internet friends who maybe in some ways are closer to you than even your in real life friends. That's the world that we're in right now. Anyway, so on to culture wars, because I think this is a big question. I don't have my own mind made up on it. What strikes me is that this hyperpoliticization is in a sense always channeled into culture wars, into these kind of media discourse driven polarizations, which supposedly take a kind of left-right form or liberal versus conservative form. And, the US provides the best example of this. But as Anton has been saying, they often don't fit the coordinates of what we would traditionally understand as left or right. So for me, I think that a lot of these questions end up coming down to not ownership or control of how society is structured, but about questions of who you are. And that's in part of the reason why they can be so fractious and so needly and so irritating and anxiety inducing, is because it's always about who you are and what type of person you are, what category you fit into, rather than about, hey, how are we going to change society? Are we going to change it in this direction or another? So my conclusion is still that it is culture war, albeit culture war that is different from what is kind of the template of culture war taken from the United States post the 1960s, but especially in the 1980s and 1990s, which generally concerned moral issues about abortion, about homosexuality, about education, how to raise your children, those sorts of questions, to a certain extent about race as well. Whereas now, things which are more properly political, things about, for example, immigration, still end up collapsing into the template of culture war, of this kind of relatively sterile polarization, which is always comes down to who are you, rather than trying to build solutions or to build organizations or institutions which can see through real political demands.
I think the case of France with Eric Zemmour is a very telling example of what we're talking about, insofar as it clearly testifies to a degree of Americanization or the importation of culture war templates, which didn't quite exist in that form in France before. Also with the rise of these commercial news channels, which are very much like the American Fox ecosystem, which France had versions of before, but which weren't quite as present until the French public sphere properly digitalized in the 2010s, where you had the rise of these digital parties with Mélenchon, but also someone like Zemmour really became prominent and famous through people watching clips and excerpts of his journalistic work on YouTube. So he's very much sort of political journalist turned political entrepreneur that attained or that thanked a lot of his popularity to a digital audience. But at the same time, if you look at how Zemmour actually compiled this program, it's culturalist or reductionist to the extent that he really does believe that by getting rid of the entire immigrant population and by throwing out all the Muslims or rounding them up in camps or stopping family reunions, you will find a solution to all of the economic problems that have ailed France in the last 40 years, from massive deindustrialization to social penury you get in these regional cities. And his proposal, for example, to reindustrialize France is literally just to cut taxes, which is a method that has been applied with amazing.
More of the same medicine that made you ill in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So there is intense turbocharged cultural warring in an American style in France. It's hyper political insofar as everyone has a view on Zemmour and he's extremely divisive in all these social quarters. But then when it comes to the actual question of policy, the solution is either just throw all the foreigners out and that will solve the issue of the state deficit, or will solve the immigration problem and cut taxes, and then we'll get all our industry back at the same time. So that really shows the limit of that hyperpolitics, both from the right and also from the left, insofar as there's just no concrete plan on what he's actually going to do about the shrinking industrial base of France, except for saying, well, we'll just get rid of the Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of one of the reasons I'd probably disagree with Alex's presentation to a certain extent, is that it seems like those sorts of, or there's always, or it seems to me like it's important always to assume that there's a material basis to these culture war issues, that it's not, there might be a cultural element or display, but some people win and some people lose, and that's ultimately what's kind of driving it on. So I guess maybe this is the thing about hyperpolitics, is that, and I don't think this is what you were saying, Anton, but some people sort of suggest that it is just moral politicization or just culture wars. But of course, these things ultimately, if you're talking about cutting taxes, which was kind of like a weird anti-homeopathy. I was trying to think if there's any like medical analogy for like something made you sick, so macrodose it and it will make you better. But but there's always like these kind of cultural
it's like
issues.
Munchausen syndrome. It's neoliberal Munchausen syndrome. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to describe it.
Yeah. I think reverse homeopathy is better, but that doesn't, or reverse vaccination. Anyway, whatever. I did have a point, and it was a very simple one actually, and I probably could have made it a lot more straightforwardly. Just that it's like the questions of ownership and control, sure, sideline, but that doesn't mean that it's just recognition. I think there's always the kind of the parlaying of virtue into
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that Zemmour uniquely and quite innovatively has a plank that calls for reindustrialization, which is quite a daring proposal to make, certainly within the sort of orthodoxy of so much of the French right, which has been worried about it in shrinking industrial base, but which hasn't actually come forward with these explicit calls to reindustrialize the country. And he's now actually doing that. That is not just a culture war issue. It can't be reduced to culture. But at the same time, if you look at the proposals or the solutions he's actually putting forward, they're just pitiful and frankly laughable compared to the size of the challenge he's actually pointing at.
I think, it also touches upon something else, I suppose, which is that this kind of builds off what Alex was saying, but it goes even beyond questions of ownership and control, right, to some degree. Questions, say, of industrial, how far is the deindustrialization of these countries, beyond kind of questions of employment and jobs, but also thinking about geopolitics, questions of economic efficiency, about questions of the necessity of economic self-sufficiency and preparedness for kind of unexpected, or not to say unexpected because the COVID pandemic wasn't unexpected, but for shocks such as a viral pandemic. Industrialization is a question that goes beyond just ownership and control, it seems to me. And so that the scope of these political questions is broader than just questions of power. And perhaps that's also, I think perhaps that's also where the culture wars limits of politics are visible. Because I think occasionally questions of ownership and control will creep into these debates. And they'll take particular kind of peculiar forms, in say like the kind of the woke critique that our institutions and our societies are still dominated by the legacy of racial European colonial empires that evaporated decades, if not centuries ago in some instances. But they'll make the case that they're still dominated by that, and that we need, these societies need to be restructured or reconfigured in some way as part of a program of decolonization. And so that touches upon ownership and control, but in ways that are totally hallucinatory and have no actual connection to the existing distribution of power and resources in contemporary society. But nonetheless, they kind of engage those questions, even if in an ultimately illusory way.
Yeah.
Whereas it seems to me there are kind of other questions, and perhaps ones that are also being raised by certain figures such as Zemmour, for instance, that go beyond questions of ownership and control, but that do require political responses. And another example, I mean, and one that we've kind of talked about at length on this podcast would be, for instance, membership of the Eurozone, or say capacity, whether or not you have sovereign capacity to issue and control your own fiat currency, as well as, say, or membership of the European Union, or these kinds of questions. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to have popular control over certain kinds of governmental decision making? Those are political questions, I think, in specific policy domains that go beyond just broad kind of issues of ownership and control.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so maybe cultural war isn't the right term, but I think I'm still trying to capture something that I think here we're all on the same page, that on the one level, it's kind of spectral and spectacular rather than concrete, and that there doesn't seem to be any movement beyond these kind of fixed positions. So yes, it's competitive. Yes, it's agonistic. Yes, you have these two camps who touch on, for example, the issue of vaccination. At least theoretically, it touches on very serious questions about the limits of state power, of state intrusion into private life, about coercion, about the role that the state should play in guaranteeing health, all these very important questions. And at the same time, it seems to somehow, I don't know, produce a kind of sterile polarization with a lot of heat and noise, but without any movement whatsoever. It's a little bit like a kind of Verdun scenario or something, where you're just lobbing bombs and there's just this mutual destruction, but there's no advance whatsoever. And that's what I'm trying to capture, and also the way in which it becomes very intimately tied to one's identity, right? And that's the kind of maybe cultural aspect, that, what side, whether you're anti-vax or, pro-vaccine passes, is very much about kind of what milieu you inhabit, and a defense of that milieu, and also, and one other aspect of this is a mutual incomprehension, right? So it's not that we are clear about what the terms of the debate of the vaccination thing are, because we question the very basis of what we understand to be at stake here. So for the side who are, insisting that you need to force vaccinate everyone or institute vaccine mandate, there's an idea that I couldn't possibly understand why someone might be resistant to getting vaccinated. And it is, and that there's no question of state power here. What's the issue? Why are you raising this issue? And for the other side, it's so blindingly obvious that this is a huge oppressive thing, and that they couldn't possibly understand how come. So on the other side could be so blithe about saying, yeah, just forcibly vaccinate everyone. And this mutual incomprehension is something which is perhaps unique to our times. I think that there's no general kind of consciousness about what is really at stake, perhaps.
No, and I think we need to be very clear that it can't be reduced to some of these almost banal culture war topics, which are almost non-topics, whether we're talking about the color of bathroom doors towards what writers go in the syllabus. All of the phenomena we're talking about have, or at least hint at, a policy content which is quite ambitious and quite clear, whether we're talking about Zemmour's plea for reindustrialization, whether we talk about the BLM demand for reparations or the vaccine question. There are some big institutional policy questions in the background. While at the same time, the way those debates get channeled just means that none of the actual institutional mediation can actually ever take place. There is just no sense about how you might shift the parameters of some of these questions. And instead, they just get tied to these political opinions, which become identities, which turns them into a trench war, as Alex concluded.
Okay, so I mean, to bring it back, I guess, to some very important political economic trends, and it's something that you kind of hint at in the article, Anton. It's that, is there real politicization going on? Yeah, we've been talking about these issues. You've mentioned like BLM, vaccination, immigration, and so on, reindustrialization. But the general trend seems to be to a political setup where central banks are ever more important, where they're executive and sovereign even, and that the means of government are cash transfers, with very other little government in the middle of that. And then all the rest of what would formally constitute politics is policing, state repression in some form or another, and media discourse, which doesn't seem to gain any traction on the really important stuff. Do you think that, and I don't know, like, do you agree with that characterization? And two, where does that leave this hyperpolitics? I mean, is it just still more futile scrambling and noise, or does it at some point begin to gain traction?
I think what we're talking about is basically a process of disintermediation, which we are familiar with on the level of civil society, which is the Peter Mayer Void story we all know, but which also happens on the level of the state, which is that you have disintermediation of the state from that civil society as such, in which the involvement of the state in the economy, certainly under the era of neoliberalism, becomes far more abstract and becomes more detached. So there is a role for the state as market police, or as the organ that actually protects markets, but for the rest, there is no concrete involvement it has in economic activity. And certainly after COVID, that has beginning to change insofar as there's a pastoral or protective role in the state, which is everyone acknowledging at the same time. And I would say that hyperpolitics is the expression of a new consciousness of contradiction, or at least a sense that the role which the state was relegated to in the neoliberal era, or even before 2008 and then after 2008, is no longer viable. But we're still in this transitional period in which it's not at all clear whether that new state is functioning or has actually conceptualized its role. And what it mostly does is like mole whacking or resorting to the most authoritarian measures to actually solve that deficit of legitimacy. So disintermediation doesn't end, whether on the level of civil society or on the level of the state, but the degree to which the state relates to society and the society relates to the state has changed insofar as that passivity or that complete retreat has ended. So that comfortable situation is really, really over.
I mean, it makes me wonder whether, it's kind of more like moving to a 19th century scenario where there's a lot less thickness of the state, the layers of the state between citizen and state. The difference, of course, and where there is a lot of thickness, I guess, is in policing, in different forms of social control, which leaves us rather in a more difficult situation, if you're trying to think of it from a kind of revolutionary perspective, than in the 19th century, because there they might be, police and whatever, and the army to crush you, but you don't have all these very much more sophisticated forms of surveillance and control that they did in the 19th century. That's just something that kind of sprung to mind. I don't know if anybody wants to take that one up.
No, I've been thinking about this side. Like, I think it's in David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism, where he basically takes the point from Gramsci that like the state now includes the state and civil society, to be kind of crude and blunt about it. And it's like, I think that is true, that the governing institutions are, at the same time that the state has lost some great capacity, it has gained a whole sort of set of arm's length and vaguely related, more or less related kind of civil society institutions. And they're not all necessarily policing or coercive, like in content, but certainly like the I can't remember what word, in fact, or how Harvey exactly describes it, but I think it's essentially correct that that's the neoliberal model of governance doesn't just include the state, but it also includes large parts of civil society as well.
Yeah, so I mean, civil society is absorbed into the state, but then there is no kind of real civil society left there. Is that sort of the idea?
I know. I think it's like, it's not that there's real or not real civil society. It's just that like some of the consent generating functions of the state, or which were previously carried out by the state, are now outsourced to civil society organizations. So I think he does talk about it in terms of governance, and that's the idea, that kind of unity of the state and various civil society actors. Yeah, well, far more sophisticated forms of propaganda, I guess, than maybe there were in the past. I wanted to move on to one other
aspect that you draw upon, Anton, and you draw upon a term used by Mark Fisher, which is Stalinism without utopia. And that, I think, specifically refers to online or online style hyperpolitical discourse, which I think everyone in this call, everyone listening to this is intimately familiar with. And you hate it, but you still do it. And I wanted to kind of
speak for yourself, Alex.
Well, we, whether you like it or not, it's always interested in you, and the discourse comes and envelops you.
You might not like it, but you have to go along with it.
Yeah,
is that what you're saying?
And it is, what I want to draw upon, because I don't want to talk about, and have a kind of general complaint about, it's so annoying how Twitter is, right? I think what's more interesting is to try to see whether these kind of modes of discourse are actually now filtering into the real world, and that this is kind of the form that hyperpolitics takes in a more generalized sense. And let me just quote from your article, if you don't mind. It's an ascetic aesthetic with highly judgmental norms for interpersonal engagement, rigid enforcement of mores, and libertine abstentionism, now mediated through new digital platforms, but without the utopian calculus that justified the cruelty of the commissar and the party official. So we were just discussing this before you came on, Anton, and that element of kind of rigidly enforcing norms and mores seems very obviously to be the case with kind of liberal identity politics. But I'm wondering whether this Stalinism without utopia applies to the kind of hyperpolitics across society, as you described it. It's a mood across society. Do you think that applies? Do you think that description applies?
Yes, and I think we should point at the contradiction which Fisher himself was onto with the internet, is that we remember the internet as being designed, or first being conceived, as a sort of normless, anti-authoritarian space for connection, which would supposedly remedy all the vertical or the hierarchical aspects of those other organizational forms we knew from the 20th century. So it's a purely voluntary association which people can enter into, and which they can have forms of connection which are no longer possible in these other institutions, which are declining or which are being rejected because they're precisely overtly authoritarian. And what you see in the 2010s, but certainly today, is that the internet begins to reproduce forms of connection which are highly claustral and suffocating, but which also have weird forms of discipline and highly normative features, which we tended to associate with those more authoritarian social forms from the 20th century. But they don't actually have the same cohesion as, for example, a party, a union, or a neighborhood association as we knew it from the 20th century. So the internet has this kind of authoritarianism without authority, or an enormous capacity to police behavior and to make sure that everyone develops techniques for self-interrogation, but without any concrete organizational goals. So the question is, like, what is this actually serving, or what is the utopian horizon we're all heading towards? Or what is the point of the discipline you're trying to enact on people at this point? And I think there the analogy with the COVID state is just very, very clear, insofar as you have a state that realizes it has to take on a protective and a pastoral role. It has to maybe engage in active coercion, or it has to manage and directly intervene into the economy, but it doesn't actually have the authority to do it. And there, the difference with the 19th century, which was very much a pre-democratic age, is just very explicit, in that their states could still claim that, well, we don't need the democratic mandate. We're states which are still heavily populated by aristocracies, and we rule simply because it's our birthright, and the unwashed masses should simply have nothing to say about that. In a post-democratic age in which we're in today, there is a sense that you need some kind of mandate to enact all these measures, but politicians or even administrators don't actually know where that mandate is supposed to come from. So you need like discipline and coercion and hierarchy, but you're not clear in whose name you're actually being so authoritarian at the same time. And you see this just very, very clearly in European COVID responses, or with someone like Macron, who is the best example of this postmodern despotism, is that Johnson is another example of this, where there's this constant sense is that they don't want to do this, they don't want to enforce these lockdowns, they don't want to lock people inside, but we simply have to. So it's like a parent that has no authority vis-a-vis their child, but is trying to do special pleading with their child and say, like, you know that you don't respect me, you know that I'm lying, you know that I'm useless, but please just do what I ask. And if you don't, then I will actually enforce very, very harsh penalties.
And in fact, Macron might have briefly broken with that, with his statement that he wants to emmerder les Français. You know, he wants to piss off the French so much until they actually go and get vaccinated.
The weird thing is, you're not going to piss off your children, right? That's not how you discipline children. Or in that point, and
he's not coercing them, and he's still not coercing them. He's not literally forcibly vaccinating them, which would be more honest, I think.
Yeah, so it's not even paternalistic in that sense. It's this very weird, almost fraternal sense of, I'm going to coax you into doing this without actually assuming that that's what I'm doing.
It's like a parent in a kind of American TV show where they try and like buddy up to the kid, and so they've like undermined any authority. So when they do have to do some disciplining, it is kind of annoying the kid into doing something by like posting on their social media and like embarrassing them in front of their friends until they're like, oh fine, all right dad, I'll do it then, whatever. So basically I'm saying that Macron is a bad parent to the French. They should
and someone at Damage Magazine, I think it was Benjamin Fong, used this metaphor quite recently as well, is that one good way of conceiving the return of the state in the COVID era is that neoliberalism very much saw the complete retreat or the separation between society and the state, insofar as the state completely gives up its presence within society. And it's like a couple that divorces and the husband moves out and only the mother, mainly the market, remains. And now suddenly the father is back after a divorce of 20 years and has to reclaim his authority vis-a-vis the children. But obviously the children don't know him at all and have never experienced parental authority in that sense. So he has huge difficulty actually posing his decisions on them, because they're like, who are you? What is your role in this family, and why should I even listen to you? Because I don't recognize you as my father anyway.
Well, and it's also like one of the siblings, not all the siblings. Actually, there's probably maybe only one out of the 4 siblings who's like, no, daddy, you need to come and really father us properly. Be more heavy-handed. What the hell are you doing? You've been away for all this time. Now come in and actually exert your function as a father. I think that is quite a good metaphor. We should maybe come back to that. One other thing, just on Stalinism without utopia. Surely this reality, if it is indeed that, is the centrist dream, because precisely for kind of capitalist centrists, it's that the problem with Stalinism was precisely the utopia. The rest of it was fine, but actually, if you can denude Stalinism or remove the utopian element of Stalinism, basically kill off any kind of grand dreams, the elements of kind of social control and discipline and all the rest are actually quite welcome.
Yeah, are we talking about online internet wars or just sort of general liberal mentality around it? Because there's this authoritarian impulse in a lot of contemporary liberalism, which I think is older than COVID.
I mean, what I'm referring to specifically, I guess, is the kind of mutual policing and self-policing that goes on. That would be a feature of totalitarianism. Everyone dobs in someone else, grasses them up to the secret police and so on. And that's something which obviously happens online, very obviously, but also it happens very much, I guess, in real life, in kind of contemporary hyperpolitics. And so this is a situation that we're all doing this not because of we might believe or not believe in kind of the people or whatever it is, that there is no kind of grand, ideology, grand public ideology. We're all cynical about it, but we still behave in all these kind of, we exert all these kind of policing functions of one another and maybe also of ourselves.
And I think the real difference with Stalin is also that there is a sort of revolutionary culmination, or there's a utopian endpoint with which all of this cruelty and all of this violence can still be justified. So this is what I talk about with the utopian calculus. While what's so strange about some of the enforcing, for example, of racial etiquette, certainly in the US context, is that it's not entirely clear what is the endpoint, because America is so irredeemably racist, most of the Western world is so irredeemably racist, that there is simply no way this can ever be redeemed. It's a form of neoliberal redemption politics which infinitely delays the point at which there will be any concrete outcome. And whatever you want to say about Stalin, there at least there was this idea of what utopia is around the corner and will have degrees of material wealth and degrees of freedom that will simply unimaginable before. But here, there is not even a point at which the redemption can be said to be fulfilled. It's just about assuming its consciousness of guilt, which doesn't lead anywhere.
Well, the only way it can be redeemed is if China takes over and then America is relieved of the responsibility to be any kind of exemplar to the world, and it's irredeemable racism is the thing that brought it down. So it's kind of good riddance.
So I just wanted to bring in one final issue, which we skipped over earlier, but we should take the opportunity. That is the 6th of January to discuss civil war, because that seems to fit quite closely with hyperpoliticization. I've just got a news alert here that Biden has just said in reference to the 6th of January last year. Are we going to be a nation that accepts political violence as a norm? Are we going to be a nation where we allow partisan election officials to overturn the legally expressed will of the people? Are we going to be a nation that lives not by the light of the truth, but in the shadow of lies? At the same time as this, it's not just politicians' declarations, but military strategists, people working in military and kind of think tanks, have been talking both actually in France as in the US about the threat of a civil war. And I wonder how seriously we should take this, and also what purposes it serves, because I am suspicious that it rather serves elite purposes to talk up civil war, which is really a very radical difference to the post-political era of the 90s and 2000s and the emphasis on consensus.
Did Biden actually answer all those rhetorical questions? Are they going to be a nation of all of those things? Or did he just but
they were all non sequiturs. He's like, in the bathtub, yes, please, more candy. And, it just didn't really make any sense.
Who doesn't want more candy?
I mean, no, that's right. Indeed. That is the real rhetorical question.
But I think you did have a more serious point. We've talked about civil wars before, not just in our own civil war style bickering within the podcast. But yeah, so maybe that's a question for Anton, more than me and Phil. You know what we think about it?
No, I think Phil is the real academic specialist here. I think it's a hugely unlikely outcome, given how demilitarized so many societies are on that level. But it's also that hyperpolitics entails a degree of hyperpolarization, but precisely because it's so organizationally aphatic or so organizationally vague, I don't see how it can descend into a situation where you have actual military blocs confronting each other.
Yeah, I'm not a civil war specialist in terms of my academic area of expertise, but I'd agree with Anton. It's difficult to it's partly that feeling of disintegration after a period of liberal consensus. I think that, but at the same time, I think it's also a distinctively kind of social fragmentation that is the product of neoliberalism. So there is given the absence of the dysfunction or the crumbling or ineffectiveness of all sorts of political institutions, and the absence of any of the pre-existing social solidarities that, such as nation, for instance, or even class in the case of pre-existing kind of trade unions, for instance, when you had much more of a organized labor movement. In the absence of those solidarities, that sense of fragmentation and dissolution is felt much more keenly, I think, and that feeds in to the suspicion, the paranoia, and the feeling of social collapse and disintegration, which obviously then feeds into the feeling of the imminence or the possibility of civil war, or violent and anarchic social dislocation, which I think is more likely, but then might get talked up as civil war. If you just think, if you compare, say, today with, I don't know, the 1970s or the 1960s, when you think about the kind of the inner city riots in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, or the fact that you had, say, political assassinations in the US of major figures, not only a president, but RFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and so on, as well as, the National Guard deployed to university campuses. There are other periods of, in many ways, much more violent upheaval in the US, where at the same time it was, I'm sure people felt very similar kinds of sentiments that society was disintegrating, or there could be some kind of racial civil war in the inner cities or something like that. And those were, the mood tells you, or those sentiments tell you about the mood of society, but they don't actually, there wasn't any realistic prospect of mass level violence that a civil war would entail. So I think that's, I think that's the qualifier to the feelings. I think the sentiment is genuine and it can be explained, but that doesn't indicate the reality like Anton says, of organized military factions battling for state power. And I think that's the other element as well. There is now the idea that you could have meaningful organized political competition over state power that belongs to a prior period. It's precisely the absence of meaningful political competition for state power that is our problem, right? The fact that the ways in which you could structure that kind of competition and that you exercise state power in a meaningful and effective way, the absence of that is why it's so difficult to envisage what a civil war that would actually resolve the problems of society would look like, right? Yeah. So, I mean, if there, it would be, civil war of the kind of Lebanon style rather than civil war on the traditional kind of classical model of civil war that led to the formation of modern states and modern nations.
So bad civil war, not good civil war. Is that what you're saying?
Essentially, yes.
we can have civil war, but not in conditions and not of the sort of our own choosing.
Well, or as Axl Rose said, what's so civil about war anyway? Yeah,
there you go.
But I think that does what Phil said there is very well put, and I think it does then beg the question of why in that case are very serious people, not just people in general in society, worrying about a potential civil war, breakdown of society and so on, but that these very serious military strategists are putting out papers, the kind of higher echelons of the French military putting out papers saying that we're very serious about a civil war in the coming decade. What's actually behind that, and when politicians take that up, what's behind that? I mean, it does make me wonder whether hyperpolitics is potentially a way, and not suggesting that a conspiracy here, but that it becomes a way of managing political conflict rather than the actual bursting forth of genuine political conflict and contestation. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that before we close up. Otherwise, we'll just leave that as an open question. And I guess what's all that's left to say is that if society is indeed suffering from a political attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, what's the political Ritalin? What's the political Adderall? Anyway, serious, focused political minds. That's what we want here on Bungacast. Everyone's cringing and trying to look away from me right now. Okay, that's it from us for now. We are back next week. I think we are talking about green pedophiles. If you don't know what that is, you'll have to tune in next week. That'll be an episode that's out on Patreon, so you'll have to subscribe to that. Bye-bye. And thank you very much to Anton for joining us for this great discussion.
Thank you.